June 19, 1943, Regensburg, Germany, 22,000 feet above the Danube River. The Luftwaffe pilot steadied his Messerschmitt's altitude, his gloved hands wrapped tightly around the stick. The sky was calm, the horizon stretched wide and silent, only the faint hum of engines in the far distance hinted at movement. Through his goggles, he scanned the blue expanse. At first, it was nothing, a smudge, a mistake of the eyes. But then, the dots came into focus. Not 5, not 10, dozens. Black line drawing itself across the sky. He blinked, leaned forward. They were bombers, and not the usual handful the Americans sent over in clumsy attempts. This was something else. A tide, a swarm, an aerial wall slowly rising over the Bavarian horizon. B-17s, row after row, flying in formation tighter than anything he had ever seen. It was like the sky itself had grown engines. He reached for the radio, and his voice cracked in disbelief. The ground controllers didn't believe him. He was told to remain calm, to double-check the number. He did, again and again. The same result. There were too many. By the time they could verify the scale of the formation, it was already too late. Anti-aircraft batteries scrambled. Squadrons were called in. But there was no panic. Not yet. They had seen bombers before. They had torn them apart. The B-17s were slow. They were heavy. And they were large targets. The pilots of the Luftwaffe had turned many of them into falling wreckage. But as the massive formation advanced, there was a different kind of silence in the command bunker. Something didn't make sense. Where had these aircraft come from? And how? Intelligence reports estimated that American factories couldn't possibly sustain this rate of production. Germany's own analysts had charted the numbers. To see this many bombers in the air at the same time wasn't just unexpected. It was mathematically impossible. And yet, here they were. As the first bombs fell on the ET-1 industrial sector near Regensburg, flames shot up into the sky like a warning. This wasn't a raid, it was a message, a statement written in fire and steel. By the end of that single day, German radar would log over 350 heavy bombers crossing into their airspace, more than in any previous week combined. What the Luftwaffe witnessed wasn't a tactical assault, it was the arrival of a new type of war. Until that moment, the German High Command had fought with a belief that air superiority was won. By skill, by discipline, by machines built with precision and flown by elite pilots. That the Allies were too slow, too bureaucratic, too disorganized to pose a serious long-term threat in the skies. But something had changed. The Luftwaffe pilots knew what an air campaign looked like. They had pioneered it over Poland, perfected it over France, and suffered it over Britain. But this was something they hadn't seen before. It didn't look like strategy. It looked like replication, repetition, as if someone had found a way to duplicate bombers like copies from a printing press. Even the radio chatter, normally filled with confidence, began to shift in tone. One veteran pilot, Oberleutnant Rolf Grunfeld, reportedly said over the channel, "They're not coming to fight, they're coming to erase." That phrase was later redacted from official reports. Back at base, as wreckage reports poured in and interception missions failed to break the bomber streams, one general walked into the operations room in Berlin and threw a folder across the table. "Sabotage," he hissed. Or something worse. No country builds this fast. The word spread like smoke. Sabotage. Industrial espionage. Maybe even disinformation. The only conclusion they could accept was that someone, somewhere, had lied. Lied to inflate American capability. Because the alternative, that the Americans had actually built this force, was too terrifying to contemplate. What the Luftwaffe didn't know, couldn't know, was that the nightmare was only beginning. These weren't the last bombers. They were the first. At Willow Run, in the United States, a single factory was already producing a bomber every 55 minutes. 45,000 workers. Endless steel. No pauses. No mercy. While German commanders debated sabotage, American assembly lines kept rolling, fueled by the kind of industrial logic the Reich had underestimated for too long. One German intelligence officer wrote in his post-war memoir, "We assumed they would fight like we fought. We assumed they would think like we thought, but they didn't. They turned war into math, and math doesn't care about pride. In the quiet moments between bombing waves, some officers stared at the maps and tried to calculate how long they could hold, how many squadrons remained, how many pilots. But with every new raid, those numbers lost meaning. The sky was no longer a battlefield, it was a conveyor belt, and no amount of genius tactics could stop the belt from moving. What began that day over Regensburg was not just a shift in air power. It was the moment the German war machine realized it was no longer fighting an army. It was fighting a system too big to bomb, too fast to catch, too methodical to break. And for the first time since 1939, the Luftwaffe stopped laughing. If this kind of storytelling moves you, drop a comment below with your thoughts, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel to support this journey through forgotten military history. Long before the sky over Regensburg turned black with bombers, the German High Command had already written the script of the war they expected to fight. It was a war of finesse, precision, German engineering at the center, strategy as the sharpened edge, and elite pilots guiding aircraft designed to dominate the skies through sheer technical superiority. Every piece of doctrine, every training manual, every speech given by Luftwaffe officers reinforced the same belief: quality over quantity, brilliance over brute force. And when it came to industrial capability, the Reich held a dangerous assumption. They believed America was too soft to produce in war. It wasn't just arrogance, it was a worldview, a doctrine that shaped their decisions and clouded their judgment. In the eyes of the Wehrmacht's leadership, the United States was a nation of consumers, not warriors, a land of excess and comfort, not sacrifice and endurance. Its factories were scattered, its workers unprepared, its spirit too capitalist to sustain military effort. Intelligence assessments routinely labeled the U.S. military as disorganized, its pilots as undertrained, its aircraft as over-engineered and underprotected. There was even a phrase whispered with dry humor in Luftwaffe circles. They called the American airmen milk bottle pilots, the idea being that their hands were too soft, their bellies too full, their discipline too weak, that their entire air force had been bottle-fed too, pampered to survive the crucible of the European skies. That view was shared not only in bunkers and briefings, but etched into Germany's military philosophy. The Luftwaffe itself had grown from a revolutionary concept: fast, surgical, technologically advanced. From the blistering dives of the Stuka to the sleek agility of the Messerschmitt Bf 109, Germany believed in dominance through design. Their aces had names, scores, legends. Their formations flew with synchronized aggression. They didn't just fight. They hunted, and it had worked. In Poland, in France, in the early days over the English Channel, the Luftwaffe had torn through resistance with terrifying efficiency. No one in Berlin saw a reason to change course. So when word spread of American efforts to ramp up aircraft production, the response was a smirk. They thought it was a bluff. After all, how could a country with no standing tradition of total war possibly challenge the Reich's military-industrial machine? How could workers in Detroit or Kansas or Seattle ever match the precision of German technicians trained under the shadow of Junkers, Heinkel, and Messerschmitt? How could mass production ever outfight mastery? But buried in that condescension was a fatal error. Because while the German war machine was optimized for brilliance, it wasn't built for longevity. Its aircraft were crafted like watches, elegant, effective, but delicate under stress. Pilots needed months of training. Factories needed rare. Metals, parts were specialized. The entire system was a masterpiece of engineering and a nightmare to scale. And scale was exactly what the Americans were preparing for. While Nazi officials mocked American air power, the U.S. War Department was reorganizing the very definition of warfare. Instead of chasing perfection, they were chasing repetition. Instead of one fighter that could win a duel, they wanted 10 that could win the war. They weren't trying to build the best bomber. They were trying to build the last one you would ever see. The German obsession with tactical superiority blinded them to the quiet revolution happening across the Atlantic. The Ford Motor Company was converting automobile plants into bomber lines. Boeing was training entire cities to produce wings, rivets, engines, and cockpits on a clockwork schedule. And while German engineers insisted that quality could never come from quantity, the Americans were busy proving that quality could be standardized. One of the most revealing German documents found after the war was a confidential report dated mid-1943 attempting to estimate the true number of bombers the U.S. could produce monthly. The author, based on pre-war production figures and peacetime logic, guessed around 600 to 800 per month. In reality, the number would soon exceed 2,000. By 1944, that number would double. They were off by a margin so wide, it wasn't just incorrect, it was catastrophic. What Germany failed to grasp was that American factories didn't just make airplanes, they made systems that made airplanes. Assembly lines inside assembly lines, subcontractors feeding subcontractors, a logistical spiderweb with no center, only motion, and motion is what wins long wars. The Luftwaffe's pilots may have been the best in the world at dogfighting, but what happens when the sky stops offering fights, and instead offers waves? What happens when every B-17 you shoot down is replaced by 2 more before the oil on your engine cools? That was a question the Luftwaffe was not prepared to answer, because the Reich's air strategy depended on being feared, on the idea that no one would dare challenge them at altitude. But fear doesn't stop machines, and the American war machine had already passed the point of fear. It had entered automation. In that sense, the skies over Europe were about to transform, no longer ruled by aces chasing glory, but by formations executing functions. Pilots became operators, missions became math, the battlefield became a ledger, and every time a Luftwaffe squadron intercepted a bomber stream, they weren't just confronting aircraft, they were confronting a belief system, one that said war was not a display of talent, but a process of momentum. For the German pilots, who had trained their entire lives for aerial duels, it was a nightmare. Their skill was useless against scale. Their instincts drowned in the noise of 1,000 engines. The arrogance that had once filled the Luftwaffe's briefing rooms was slowly replaced by a colder feeling. Recognition that perhaps they had underestimated not just the enemy, but the very nature of modern war. And that recognition would come too late. If stories like this make you rethink the past in ways history books never did, let us know your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more forgotten truths from the skies of World War II. In the heart of Michigan, nestled between farmland and forests, stood a factory unlike anything the world had ever seen. Its name was Willow Run, but what emerged from its colossal doors had nothing to do with agriculture. It was a cathedral of industry, born not from tradition, but from urgency, from desperation, from the cold understanding that winning the war would not come from daring raids or brilliant generals, but from relentless repetition. Willow Run was Ford's answer to a question no one in Germany believed America could ask, let alone answer. Could you mass-produce a heavy bomber? Not build it, not assemble it, but mass-produce it, the way you would a car, with parts that were interchangeable, with workers trained not to design, but to execute, and with machines calibrated to minutes, not months. When the plans were first proposed, even some American generals scoffed. The B-24 Liberator was a massive 4-engine aircraft, over 60 feet long, more than 100 feet in wingspan. It took over 1 million parts to build. At the time, each bomber required more than 200,000 labor hours. Ford said they could reduce that to less than 10,000. People thought it was madness, but what they underestimated was not the machine, it was the mindset. Henry Ford's team, led by Charles Sorensen, known as Cast Iron Charlie, took the philosophy of the moving assembly line and injected it into aviation. Sorensen once walked through an empty field and pointed to the dirt and said, "We'll build the largest factory in the world, and we'll make a bomber every hour." People laughed. 2 years later, they weren't laughing. The plant stretched for more than a mile. Its layout was shaped like an L to fit the landscape. But that curve was not an accident. It was a symbol. The bomber would start as raw aluminum at one end, and by the time it reached the final corner, it would be a complete aircraft, ready to fly. 42,000 workers moved like clockwork. Women, many of them former homemakers or school teachers, learned to rivet, to weld, to wire instrument panels with speed and precision. They became known as the Rosies. They wore bandanas and overalls. They carried the war on their shoulders. The numbers defied belief. At its peak, Willow Run was rolling out one B-24 Liberator every 55 minutes. Not one a week, not one a day. One every 55 minutes. A pace so fast that German intelligence analysts refused to believe it. They assumed the reports were exaggerated or the result of poor data collection. One Luftwaffe report even stated, "No single facility can maintain this level of output without deception or sabotage." But there was no deception, only discipline. And while Willow Run was the most famous, it was only one node in a much larger web. Boeing in Seattle was producing B-17s around the clock. Consolidated Aircraft was building in San Diego. North American Aviation, Douglas, Lockheed, and countless subcontractors were feeding the war engine. The system was staggering in scale. Each bomber required engines from one plant, propellers from another, radios from a third, gun turrets from a fourth. But instead of breaking down, the system synced, like an orchestra conducted by blueprints and deadlines. The result was a new type of warfare, not shaped by the elegance of design, but by the predictability of production. America was not building planes, it was building momentum. And with each completed aircraft, that momentum grew. Pilots arriving at airfields in England would sometimes joke that the paint was still drying on their bombers, because it was. In some cases, aircraft rolled off the production line, flew across the Atlantic, and entered combat within days. There was no time to marvel at craftsmanship. These were not monuments. They were instruments, tools designed to function, fail, and be replaced. It was a rhythm the Germans could not match. Their factories were sophisticated but rigid. Their engineers were brilliant but few, and their supply lines, under constant attack, were shrinking by the month. While Germany struggled to replace one destroyed aircraft, America was building 5. Even Hitler, in one of his final strategy meetings, is said to have raged that America was not fighting fair by turning war into industry. But war has never been fair. And in this new war, speed was the sharpest weapon. Perhaps the most haunting realization for the Luftwaffe came not from the skies, but from the factory floor. They had spent years preparing for duels, for one against one, for skill against skill. But what they were facing now was a machine, a faceless, tireless machine that did not pause for victories or mourn its losses. It only moved forward. And every time a new bomber lifted off from Willow Run or Boeing Field, it wasn't just carrying bombs, it was carrying proof that America had cracked the code, that the future of war belonged not to the genius, but to the grinder. The American home front had become a battlefield of its own, a place where time zones were weapons and labor shifts were ammunition, where each clank of a rivet gun echoed louder than any propaganda speech from Berlin. The sky over Europe was changing, and the change wasn't coming from strategy, it was coming from production. If this chapter in history sparked something in you, leave a comment sharing what stood out the most, and be sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next mission into the untold side of World War II. By late 1943, something strange began happening inside Luftwaffe intelligence circles. The H numbers stopped making sense. German radar stations along the French coast and deep inside the Reich had started reporting a disturbing trend. Not just that American bombers were appearing more frequently, but that the number of aircraft flying per mission was growing exponentially, far beyond projected estimates. Each time the Luftwaffe scrambled its fighters to intercept a raid, they encountered formations that were larger, denser, and more tightly coordinated than before. The reports came in like whispers at first, then questions, then accusations. How could the Americans be losing dozens of bombers per mission and still come back with more the next day? How could an aircraft that took so many resources to build be showing up in numbers that defied all calculations? German analysts believed the Allies were bluffing, inflating numbers through propaganda, or worse, feeding false data through double agents. The term sabotage began circulating inside closed meetings. Generals demanded investigations. Some accused their own intelligence units of incompetence. Others accused American industry of faking production statistics to lure Germany into a false sense of inferiority. A theory emerged that perhaps the same aircraft were being flown in loops, re-entering radar range repeatedly to mimic larger formations. But the theory collapsed under its own weight. Wreckage recovered from crash sites told another story. Serial numbers confirmed authenticity. Paint schemes varied. Crews were identified. Dog tags, personal effects. Radios still tuned to Allied frequencies. These were not decoys. They were not fakes. They were real. And they were arriving in waves that the Luftwaffe could not contain. In some sectors, German pilots were forced to launch missions against formations that outnumbered them 10-1. Interceptions became suicide runs. Even when they managed to shoot down several bombers, the formation never broke. Gunners returned fire from every direction. The tight box formations created a wall of lead in the sky, where even the most experienced German ace had to gamble his life just to get a shot. There was no glory left in it, only attrition. Pilots began reporting signs of exhaustion and dread. Mission briefings no longer included estimated enemy counts, not because they lacked the data, but because the numbers were demoralizing. What was once described with pride as a glorious defense of the Reich became, in the words of one German officer, a futile exercise in arithmetic. Each downed bomber was a point on a chart, but for every dot that vanished, 2 more appeared the next week. It was as if the Americans had found a way to make aircraft out of air itself. Inside the upper levels of the Reich Air Ministry, tensions grew. One general slammed a folder on the desk and shouted, "Either our intelligence is compromised, or our understanding of industrial warfare is obsolete." No one in the room answered, because deep down, they all suspected the ID2 same truth. The problem was not sabotage. The problem was reality. Germany was beginning to face the full weight of its own miscalculation. Its industrial infrastructure was vast but vulnerable. Its factories, rail lines, and power grids were already stretched thin. American and British bombing campaigns had begun to take a toll. Every destroyed factory delayed replacements. Every damaged rail station slowed logistics. The Reich could not produce and protect at the same time, and time was the one thing they were running out of. Compounding the issue was the rigid nature of the German supply chain. Aircraft parts often came from different regions, each with their own dependencies. A single missing shipment could delay production by weeks. Precision manufacturing, once their pride, became a bottleneck. Skilled labor was increasingly scarce, and raw materials were harder to acquire with each passing month. Meanwhile, the Americans were producing not just faster, but smarter. Entire systems were developed to ensure continuity of production. If one plant was bombed, another could pick up the slack. If an engine shipment was delayed, backup inventories covered the gap. While German factories were monuments to engineering, American factories were modular, flexible, and built to recover. That difference in philosophy became fatal. One German intelligence report from 1944 estimated that at current attrition rates, the Luftwaffe would run out of veteran pilots in 6 months. Not planes, not fuel, pilots, the human capital that no factory could replicate. And yet the Americans kept arriving. Fresh crews, fresh aircraft, new strategies. It was no longer about tactics. It was about rhythm, the rhythm of industry, of time zones aligned, of trains arriving precisely when the blueprints said they should, of machines that never slept, factories that never rested, schedules that cared nothing for the weather or for the wounded. The Luftwaffe had entered the war as a sword, sharp, fast, deadly. But swords break against machines, and what once looked like strategic superiority now felt like stubbornness. Inside briefing rooms, maps were updated with new routes, new targets, new contingencies, but none of them addressed the real issue, that the war had shifted beneath their feet, and that no plan, no maneuver, no last stand would be enough to outpace the storm that was coming. A storm built not in laboratories, but in silence, in metal, in repetition. Pull back the curtain on the industrial truth behind the battlefield. Take a moment to drop your thoughts below and subscribe so we can keep digging deeper into the stories history almost forgot. The B-17 Flying Fortress was never meant to be beautiful. It was built to be brutal. A high-altitude heavy bomber designed not for elegance or speed, but for endurance. It carried over 4,000 pounds of bombs, had a range of more than 2,000 miles, and could fly higher than most German fighters could reach without straining their engines. But what made it terrifying was not its firepower or armor. It was its repeatability. The true genius behind the B-17 was not in the plane itself. It was in the way it was manufactured. The Americans had discovered something the Germans refused to believe. That reliability was a weapon. That replication was a form of attack. That an aircraft did not need to be perfect if it never stopped coming. And the B-17 never stopped coming. It was built in Seattle, in Long Beach, in Tulsa, and in a dozen other cities. Hundreds of subcontractors fed into its frame. Radios came from Chicago, engines from Detroit, plexiglass from Ohio. Thousands of hands touched each bomber before it ever took to the sky. And once it was airborne, it became more than just an aircraft. It became a statement. For every one that fell in flames over the Ruhr or Berlin, 2 more were being riveted and painted back home. The B-17 was not an ace hunter or a dogfighter. It did not rely on cunning or agility. Its strength came from something far colder. It came from scale, from math, from time cards punched at factories before sunrise, from night shifts, from overtime, from coffee-stained blueprints laid across factory floors at 3 a.m. It became, in every sense, a machine of machines. The Germans saw it at first as clumsy, large, easy to target. But with each mission, their view began to change. Not because the B-17 grew faster or more advanced, but because returning again and again. The formations expanded, the sky filled with hundreds of them, then thousands. Each carried 10 men, each crew trained with a precision that mirrored the assembly lines that built their aircraft. Bombardiers studied angles and wind drift. Navigators memorized continental maps by heart. Gunners drilled until muscle memory replaced fear. But even then, no individual defined the mission. They were cogs in a larger mechanism, no more important than the rivet holding their turret or the bolt securing their control panel. That was the paradox of the American air strategy. Its power did not rest in individual excellence. It rested in collective force. The power of 300 aircraft dropping 900 tons of bombs in a single coordinated run. The terrifying truth that by the time you intercepted one wave, the next was already en route. The Luftwaffe, built on the mythology of heroic pilots and precision strikes, could not keep pace. Their aces racked up dozens of kills, but the scoreboard no longer mattered. When the enemy could lose 60 bombers in a day and show up tomorrow with 70, the concept of victory lost meaning. German commanders began to speak of the B-17 in tones once reserved for natural disasters. They described its sound as a thunderclap that rolled in from the west. Civilians in German cities learned to recognize the low drone of its engines hours before the bombs dropped. Children would count them. 1, 2, 30, 50, too many to count. And always the same thought followed. They are coming again. Because behind each mission was not a strategy, but a doctrine. A belief that numbers could win. That no matter how many were lost, the cost could be sustained. Because behind each squadron, there was a factory. And behind each factory, a network of resources, railroads, workers, and contracts. The B-17 was not simply a plane, it was the endpoint of an entire civilization choosing to outbuild rather than outfight. That philosophy extended beyond bombers. P-51 Mustangs began escorting the B-17s deep into enemy territory, punching holes in the Luftwaffe's once dominant fighter network. P-47 Thunderbolts dove on flak positions with ruthless efficiency, and below, factories churned out replacements faster than they could be destroyed. America had built not just an air force, but a feedback loop. Each sortie taught lessons. Each downed bomber led to small changes. New armor, better formation spacing, smarter gunnery tactics. System learned, it evolved. And it did so without stopping. German engineers could not understand it. Their system was based on refinement, on chasing perfection. But perfection takes time. Perfection requires stillness. America did not want perfection, it wanted permanence. To the pilots flying the B-17, the missions were grueling. 8 hours over hostile skies, flak exploding all around, oxygen masks freezing at high altitudes, watching formation mates get ripped apart in seconds. It was not glory, it was survival. Some crews named their planes. Others painted pin-up girls or hometown slogans on the nose, not out of bravado, but out of ritual, a way to personalize what had otherwise become mechanical. Some of those planes flew over 25 missions and returned home. Others vanished in smoke and fire, but the mission always continued. The aircraft were just the vessels. The real weapon was the process. The realization hit the Luftwaffe slowly, but with increasing dread. Every mission they flew cost them irreplaceable fuel, aircraft, and pilots. Every mission the Americans flew cost them a number, a statistic, a line on a report. Their dead were mourned, but they were not missing from the next operation, because the machine never stopped, even when Berlin was burning, even when refineries were cratered, even when whole factories were leveled. Somewhere, another bomber was rolling down the runway. Somewhere, another crew was checking their instruments. It was a rhythm too vast to sabotage and too disciplined to fear. If this gave you a new lens on how war can be fought with spreadsheets and sweat, leave a comment with your thoughts and hit subscribe to keep exploring the mechanical heart of the Second World War. By the spring of 1944, the rules of the air war over Europe had quietly changed. The Luftwaffe had once ruled the skies with a kind of surgical confidence. Their doctrine was built on fast interceptions, tight formations, and a core of veteran pilots who had learned their craft over Spain, Poland, and France. Every engagement was a contest of skill, a duel between fighters. But now, the duels were disappearing, replaced by floods. The B-17 formations no longer came alone. They were escorted deep into German territory by long-range P-51 Mustangs. Sleek, fast, and deadly, these American fighters could now fly from England to Berlin and back without refueling. The Luftwaffe's last great tactical advantage, the ability to isolate the bombers and pick them off, evaporated overnight. Suddenly, German fighters who tried to attack the bombers found themselves outnumbered and surrounded by American escorts. The hunter had become the hunted. Luftwaffe squadrons that once expected clean engagements now flew into coordinated traps. Pilots were shot down before they could even close the distance. But the true collapse was not tactical, it was human. By mid-1944, the Luftwaffe was losing more than just aircraft. They were losing men they could not replace. Aces with 100 or more kills were being shot down by American formations that no longer flinched. Dozens of veteran pilots, many of them trained since the 1930s, were gone within weeks. And the replacements were boys, 18, sometimes 17 years old, fresh from rushed training programs that cut corners just to get them in the air. Their first mission was often their last. They climbed into cockpits with fear in their eyes, chasing formations they could barely reach. Against a wall of 50 caliber gunfire from bomber gunners and the precision of American fighter escorts, these young recruits stood no chance. German aircraft returned from missions missing entire wings of their formation. Squadrons that took off with 30 planes landed with 5, sometimes fewer. And the aircraft themselves, once marvels of German engineering, were beginning to show the strain. Fuel shortages forced pilots to reduce training hours. Maintenance was patchy. Spare parts were salvaged from wrecks. Pilots often flew with broken radios, cracked canopies, or limited ammunition. In contrast, American crews arrived in pristine machines, fueled, armed, and checked by entire teams of ground crews. What had once been a battle was turning into a collapse. German cities began to feel the difference. Bombers were no longer harassed at the edges of German airspace. They penetrated deep. Factories in Stuttgart, Hamburg, and Leipzig were hit in broad daylight. The bombing runs came with mechanical precision, day after day, night after night. German civilians stopped running to shelters when the sirens screamed. Many just sat in silence, waiting. Power stations failed, trains stopped, hospitals overflowed, and still the bombers came. Even the Luftwaffe High Command began to speak in hushed tones. Their once proud Air Force was unraveling. The philosophy of the German air war had always centered around the ace pilot, a warrior of the skies, decorated, feared, admired. Takes years to train and months to mature. The Americans had decided they didn't need aces, they needed survivors. Crews that could fly 25 missions and live to tell about it. Men who understood formation, timing, and cold discipline more than flair or heroics. This fundamental difference began to show. While Germany invested its pride in singular excellence, America invested in durable systems. The Luftwaffe's brilliance was being swallowed by the sheer weight of an enemy that refused to stop coming. And more than that, an enemy that refused to feel the losses, because the system absorbed them. A downed B-17 was replaced before the wreck cooled. A fallen pilot was honored, but never allowed to halt the mission. There was no pause, no mourning period, only movement. The Luftwaffe, in contrast, began to feel every loss like a fracture in the body. The death of a single ace was a strategic blow. The destruction of a squadron could alter regional defenses. Every hole in the sky widened the path for the next bombing wave. And it was not just numbers. The Americans were adapting, changing their bombing patterns, testing new flak evasion techniques, shifting formations, using decoys, tuning altitudes. Each mission was a learning opportunity. Each failure became an adjustment. Over time, even German air defenses began to fall behind. Their flak batteries could not be in every city, and radar jamming became more effective. The sky was no longer theirs. It belonged to the machine. A captured German pilot said it best during an interrogation. He sat silent for minutes, then finally muttered, "They are not trying to win. They are trying to erase." That single line was not printed in official transcripts, but it circulated like a ghost inside Luftwaffe bunkers. The feeling that the war had moved beyond combat, that Germany was not fighting a country anymore. It was fighting a process, one that was faster, colder, relentless. Every takeoff became a mission, a countdown. Every sunrise, another reminder that somewhere more were coming. If this deep dive into the unraveling of an entire air force made you pause and reflect, drop your thoughts in the comments and tap subscribe so we can continue exploring the relentless mechanics of history together. By the final months of the war, the Luftwaffe no longer ruled the sky. It no longer fought to win. It fought to delay, to hold off the inevitable, to survive one more sortie, one more wave. But survival was not enough, because what had started as a contest between machines had become a war of rhythms, of factories against fatigue, of repetition against refinement. The skies no longer echoed with daring dogfights or heroic solo victories. They thundered with formation, with choreography, with noise. The noise of engines that never stopped, of bomb bay doors opening in perfect synchronization, of steel falling from heaven in metric tons, not chance. And at the center of that, transformation was not a general, not a weapon, but a system. It began in places like Willow Run and Detroit, in Kansas City, in Fort Worth, in towns where people who had never flown, never fought, never crossed the ocean, stepped onto factory floors and changed the fate of the war. Housewives, farmers, students, immigrants. They all became part of something vast, something that could not be measured by medals or speeches. They became the rhythm. A B-17 bomber had over 1.5 million parts. Each bolt, behind, each wire, each sheet of aluminum, there was a story. A hand, a mind, a shift that started at 5 a.m., a late-night double, a missed birthday, a letter unopened. These bombers were not simply machines of war. They were the condensed will of a nation. They flew with more than fuel. They flew with sacrifice. And what made them truly terrifying was not their payload or their guns. It was the knowledge that for every one that fell, another was already rising on the line. The German military, once the architect of Blitzkrieg, found itself on the other side of the storm. The Blitz had returned, but now it came from factories, from spreadsheets, from synchronized labor. Germany had gambled on brilliance, on exceptional machines and elite men, but they had misunderstood the shape of modern war. It was not about exceptional men. It was about exhaustless systems. The Luftwaffe tried to adapt, but by the time they understood the scale of what they faced, it was too late. The TDE fighter pilots were gone, the fuel was gone, the parts were gone, and worst of all, the belief was gone. The war was lost, not on the battlefield, but in the math, in the numbers that kept rising even as their cities crumbled. The final missions over Germany were not battles. They were announcements that the machine had won, not because it was perfect, but because it was unstoppable. It did not fear, it did not rest, it simply advanced, and behind it came silence. By May 1945, the Luftwaffe ground into the dust, its airfields abandoned, its squadrons broken, its veterans either dead, captured, or silent. No final charge, no last stand, only the sound of boots echoing across empty hangars, and the quiet understanding that the sky now belonged to someone else, not to a man, but to a machine. Not because it flew higher, but because it never stopped. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the unseen heart of World War II, the engine room of history, where rivets, rubber, and repetition changed the course of the world. If this story moved you, if it gave you a new way to see not just the war, but the people who built it, leave your thoughts below. We read every comment, and if you want to keep exploring these powerful, forgotten stories, click the next video that's about to appear on your screen. Subscribe if you haven't yet, and thank you for keeping history alive with us. This was not just about bombers. It was about a world that learned to fight with rhythm. And in that rhythm, the thunder spoke.